All right, Michael Troche here, back at it. Casual Roundhouse recap slash preview edition. Haven't done one of these in a long time, and this weekend is the Mexican Independence Day UFC card. It's Noche UFC. But before we get into that, I really want to talk about what happened this past weekend in Australia, where Sean Strickland became the new middleweight champion of the world. And I just want to look at this from like a technical standpoint, not anything in terms of like the way Sean is outside of the octagon. I want to talk about it from a pure fighting standpoint. He entirely neutralized every threat that Adesanya had, and it was very much so to the credit of Eric Nixick and his corner, because as Nixick stated following Strickland's win, he was calling out a lot of Adesanya's setups, which was allowing Strickland to just kind of stay calm and absorb slash just, people don't realize when you're going up against somebody like that, the best thing you can do is stay calm and just not overreact to certain feints or entries. And that's all Adesanya was looking for, was an opening so that he could capitalize. And Strickland smothered him, used his boxing, and just kept that jab and cross in his face the whole fight. And it's just crazy that somebody as brash as Strickland, who's such a character, is now the UFC middleweight champion. I'm trying to see if I can get a picture of him with the belt. I want to see if there's one. I mean, yeah. No. The one with him in the Aussie hat is the best. Look at this, man. This is our new middleweight champion of the world, and he did it strictly off fundamental boxing and incredible kickboxing defense, as well as just great corner work. And I will say as well, a lot of the Kiwis did have great results at 293, but that's something to work off of for Tafa and Tyson Pedro. And for Tuivasa and Jack Jenkins, those guys just got to go back to the drawing boards, and I'm sure they're strong-minded. They'll be back stronger than ever. I want to get into the preview for the Mexican Independence Day UFC Fight Night, which is being held in the T-Mobile Arena in Vegas. And it's headlined by the rematch of Valentina Shevchenko and Alexa Grasso for the UFC flyweight title. I had the pleasure of being at UFC 285, where the first UFC flyweight title bout between them two was held, and it was such an electric atmosphere just because there were so many Mexican fans that were cheering Grasso on, and I think it gave her a certain amount of fighting spirit that enabled her to just be super comfortable in that environment, you know what I mean, in the championship fight setting. Regardless, let's go through the picks in each fight. I'm going to be brief with each pick just because a lot of these fights don't really have much going in terms of depth, in terms of things to really look at regarding the matchups. First one being Josephine Knudsen versus Marnik Mann. Knudsen actually just got signed to the UFC off Dana White's Contender Series this year and is already making her UFC debut. I watched a little bit of tape before her Contender Series fight, and she basically just doubled down in her Contender Series fight in terms of her efficiency and just ability to always be alert and able to capitalize on any little opening slash opportunity that gives her an advantage in an MMA fight. And for that, I think she's going to beat Mann. So my pick is Josephine Knudsen. I'd probably take her by decision, but I would not be surprised if she could pull off a submission. Next, we got Alex Reyes versus Charlie Campbell. Alex Reyes has not fought since, I believe, 2017, where he got knocked out by Mike Perry, and Charlie Campbell's making his UFC debut after coming up short in Dana White's Contender Series against Chris Duncan, and he had Duncan on wobbly legs and in serious trouble, and Duncan just found a right hand from hell and capitalized for a win. So in my opinion, I think this is a bit of a toss-up fight. Is it being held? It's a lightweight fight. And it looks like the last time Reyes tried to fight at lightweight, or maybe it was a catchweight fight between him and Mike Perry, because I believe that was his last fight. either way, I'll take Charlie Campbell. He seems like he goes for the finish. Next, this is a fight that I will talk about a little bit more so, just because Jasmine Jasudavicius in her last fight against Miranda Maverick looked like she was just like beyond determined. She showed that she has that dog in her, for lack of a better term. And I don't know if that's just because she was in her hometown or in her home country and she had all of her people behind her, but regardless, it was an impressive display against somebody who's fought the best of the best at 125 up to this point. And Cortez has been relatively inactive with decision wins in most of her UFC fights. So despite Cortez being ranked a spot higher than Jasudavicius, I would favor Jasudavicius in this fight. Next is Edgar Chairez and Daniel Lacerda. I will admit, people like to just be like, oh, Chairez lost to Tatsuro Taira, and Tatsuro Taira is a very, very promising prospect at 125. But Chairez had Taira in a lot of trouble multiple times in that fight with submission attacks. And had it not been for like the end of the round, Taira, I mean, he would have found his way out, but it was a threatening attempt which showed the danger of Chairez. And Lacerda is the type of guy where if he doesn't get you out of there in the first round, like we saw against CJ Vergara, if he doesn't get you out of there in the first round, you can withstand his onslaught, which is hellacious. You have a potential to win that fight in the very next round. So I would favor Chairez, but you can't really count out the danger that comes with Daniel Lacerda. Ooh. Next fight is Roman Kopylov and Josh Fremd. So Kopylov, I remember when he fought Albert Duraev back in 2021, and I was like, wow, this guy is really tough. He's taken a lot of damage in this fight. And it's like since then, he's just completely cleaned it up, right? And he's taking this fight on short notice after a sensational head kick knockout against Ribeiro on the night of the head kick in Utah at UFC 291, where Gaethje also won the BMF belt that way. And he's taking on Josh Fremd, who's had mixed results in the UFC, but regardless, presents threats, which is something that like every person in the UFC does, obviously. But at the same time, the way that Kopylov has like taken the experiences that he's had in the octagon and built off them compared to Fremd is something that I would favor in this matchup. So with that being said, I'm going to take Roman Kopylov. I'd probably take him by finish in the second round. I also don't see Chairez versus Lacerda going the distance, but I do see Jasudavicius and Cortez potentially going the distance. Lupi Godinez and Elise Reed. This is a tough fight to make picks on because both women have been in the UFC for a good little bit, but haven't necessarily worked their way up through the rankings just yet. I mean, Godinez did fight Angela Hill, and that was an absolute banger of a fight. Let me pull up both of their resumes, as a matter of fact. I know Lupi did have I'm pretty sure she had a finish in her last win. No, she beat Emily Ducote. Okay. So Cynthia yeah, that's what, like, both of these women are a little bit unproven still in the UFC, right? But at the same time, I don't even know how to describe this fight. I would honestly just favor Godinez because she seems to have the better gas tank and she knows how to mix in her techniques better than Elise Reed. So I would probably take Lupi by decision. Next, this is an interesting fight. Fernando Padilla versus Kyle Nelson. So Kyle Nelson looks like he's an underdog, but he fought Blake Bilder. So obviously Kyle Nelson was initially known as the guy that if you don't finish the fight in the first round and a half, he will gas out. His fight against Blake Bilder was very impressive because he completely neutralized what Bilder had to offer and hurt Bilder multiple times and presented threats. And the thing about Padilla is his first UFC fight was against Julian Erosa, where he got him out of there in the first minute of the fight. So, in my opinion, I feel like there's a chance you could admit that Kyle Nelson is coming into his own when it comes to fighting in the cage. But again, that fight against Blake Bilder was in Canada, similar to Jasudavicius' situation. And I don't know how much that favors them and like helps them be more comfortable fighting. With Padilla, he was in the Apex against Erosa, who's a battle-tested vet. So, in my opinion, I would honestly favor Fernando Padilla, but I would not count Kyle Nelson out in terms of making it a tough, gritty fight, because that's what he has started to do since that initial stereotype of him only being a one-round or bust fighter was. Fernando Padilla had a very impressive UFC debut, but it was very short. So I'm just curious to see how Padilla holds up if this fight goes into the second and third round, because Nelson has been there and he's comfortable there now. That's all I'm going to say. I would favor Padilla, but you cannot count Kyle Nelson out, even though he's had mixed results. Christos Giagos versus Daniel Zellhuber. I would honestly take Zellhuber. He is very good, very well-rounded. He trains at Extreme Couture, and he's ever developing. I mean, I know, like, you know, you have one tough loss in the UFC, everybody does. You learn from it and you improve off it. That's what these guys do when they're fighting at the highest level. And if you don't do that, you're going to kind of fall into the pack. And I don't think Zellhuber is one of those guys that will fall into the pack. He's 13-1. That's a pretty good amount of experience. And if he can get past Giagos, who I'm not saying isn't a tough test, 30 fights is a lot of experience, then he will prove himself to be even more prepared for the highest level. Let's see. Okay, so Thiago Moises and Arman Sarukian. So yeah, I would take Daniel Zellhuber. Again, my picks are all opinion based off what I've seen in these guys' past few fights and stylistically. But at the same time, you know, you got Giagos, who's a bit of a brute. He's got that brute build for lightweight, whereas Zellhuber's got the like taller, lankier build. But these lanky guys are pretty strong, like Sean O'Malley, for example. So you can't really factor that in as much, but you never know. Anything can happen in this sport, as we saw with UFC 293 this past week. All right, moving on next into Raul Rosas Jr. and Terrence Mitchell. So it's unfortunate that his most previous fight ended the way it did in Raul Rosas Jr., but this is a very favorable matchup for him and Terrence Mitchell, and Terrence Mitchell still favors Rosas in terms of like experience and all that, but the UFC is setting him up for a win. So it's on Raul Rosas Jr. to go in there and get the job done. That's all you can really say about this matchup. He's still young. He's probably going to be in the UFC for a minute, but it just depends on him and the version of him that shows up on this night. It's Mexican Independence Day, mind you, so there's a possibility that he comes correct. And I'm just curious to see how much more developed Terrence Mitchell is. Ooh, the co-main event. This is a tough fight to call, because a lot of people like to talk down on Jack Della Madalena's last fight against Basil Hafez, right? But the fact of the matter is, he was supposed to fight like 2 or 3 different guys on 2 or 3 different cards and was just ready and willing. Like, he was going to fight regardless of stylistic matchup or anything like that. And when you go into a fight like that blind with no game plan per se, and he's doing multiple weight cuts, and he still comes out and puts forth the effort that he did against Basil Hafez, who, mind you, looked very good. Like, that version of Basil Hafez will win his UFC debut against mostly any other top 15 guy or guy close to the top 15. You know what I mean? That was an impressive performance on both sides, and it showed resilience on both sides. And I think people discredit Della Maddalena because of the way he fought, but he didn't have time to develop a game plan. So with that being said, Kevin Holland is no easy task. He's super powerful. He's got long limbs. He knows how to use his reach really well, and he's got serious submission threats. He's got great front chokes. He's got great scrambling ability. A lot of overlooked traits that Kevin Holland doesn't have to really show, but is able to apply when need be. This is going to probably be fight of the night. And all I'm saying is, if Kevin Holland decides to stand and trade in the pocket with Jack Della Maddalena, That's the most dangerous path for Kevin Holland. If he keeps it at range, uses his kicks initially, and jabs Jack, and then maybe works into the clinch where he can use his elbows, because Kevin Holland has really good elbows and knees in the clinch, he will cause problems, and he will have Jack shooting to where he can probably capitalize on a front choke. But the thing is, it's on Jack Della Maddalena to be either all the way in or all the way out. That's what, there's so much stylistic and just like body composition factors that go into this matchup that make it so intriguing, in my opinion. You guys let me know who you think is going to win this co-main event, because it's just such a toss-up, in my opinion. Like, Kevin Holland's got a significant height and reach advantage, but how did that fare with Randy Brown? I know Randy Brown's a different fighter than Kevin Holland. Kevin Holland's a lot more willing to trade, but Jack Della Maddalena has very good boxing from both sides, orthodox and southpaw. So keep an asterisk over this fight. And the main event, another tough fight to call, because it's like, are we seeing the regression of Valentina Shevchenko at the world-class level? Or is Alexa Grasso just coming into her own entirely as a fighter? Because if you really do recall, the fight that Alexa Grasso had against Viviane Araújo was incredible. It was a very, very good fight. She showed a lot about herself in that fight. She went the distance. She went 5 rounds, and it was a gritty battle. And she brought that same approach into the Valentina fight, and I feel like that's something that she's going to have in her back pocket again, because she will be fighting on Mexican Independence Day. Like, she's going to be comfortable yet again, similarly to UFC 285, where she had a lot of her people in there cheering her on. It's on Valentina Shevchenko to go in there and essentially take the narrative back to her side. And there's a possibility that she can. It just depends on what version of Valentina shows up, and it also depends on whether or not Alexa Grasso has evolved since winning the title, or if she is essentially become complacent. But I think there's a chance that Grasso gets it done. I think that, like, styles make fights at the end of the day, and Valentina has shown vulnerabilities in the pocket when it comes to pure boxing, where Alexa thrives. So there is a chance that Alexa gets it done. I don't know what version of Valentina is going to show up, but we'll see. The fact that we have a new UFC middleweight champion, which completely shakes up that division entirely, because you have Dricus du Plessis, who wanted to fight Izzy because of their little, whatever you want to call it, their little rivalry. But then Sean and Jared Cannonier, they need to have a rematch because of how close that fight was and how many people think Sean Strickland won that fight. So leave a comment on what you think is going to happen this weekend, and I'll see y'all in the recap.